Hello, welcome to the Entity Framework Community Stand-Up. We're back again for another session. My name's Arthur, I'm the engineering manager on Entity Framework, and I'm here with Shay and Giorgi. Shay is, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure, I'm Shay. I'm an engineer on the team. I do a lot of work on the Postgres side of databases, a lot of perf stuff, a lot of stuff with the lower level non-EF kind of database sides of .NET, and all around.
And Giorgi is our guest today. You want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Giorgi. I work as a solutions architect at Bank of Georgia, and I've been working with C# for more than 10 years, and I will show you one of the libraries that I built for Entity Framework, which hopefully you will find useful.
Excellent. So we'll get back to that later, but as is the way we usually like to start these things, let's do the state of the unicorn. There's actually not much here. It's the beginning of a release cycle. So like Andrew, for example, is heads down doing stuff for compiled model. Maurici's out there working on temporal tables. All of that stuff is going on, but there's not a whole lot of visibility. So so this will be quite short for this week. Oh, that was the wrong button. Let me go back here.
Producing's hard.
Yes, it is. Okay, let's try that. So we continue to patch. So 5.03 and 3.1.12, 3.1.12 were both released yesterday. They're on NuGet. 3.1.12 just has critical bug fixes in it right now, as appropriate for an LTS release, and 5.03 has additional fixes for 5.0 over what's in 5.01 and 5.02. So update to those versions to get the latest. EF Core 6.0, we talked about this 2 weeks ago. We were branching then. Since then, there's been a lot of wheels turning and stuff moving behind the scenes, and we're ready any day now to release that. And like I said last time, 63 enhancements, 32 bugs. A lot of those are customer or community contributions, which is really nice. Nothing big in it, but you know, it's a preview one. It's spin the wheels, make sure we can release it, that kind of stuff. Blog post that has more details on this is in progress. And another thing that we've been working on, Jeremy isn't here today, and this is his big thing, along with Shay has been doing some work on Bryce too. So we're really investigating GraphQL. We're investigating how people use it inside Microsoft and also outside Microsoft, which bits they want to do in .NET, which bits they don't, how they want to do queries and everything. So if you've got thoughts to share or stuff, you know, about GraphQL and how you use it, what you want to see, then let us know, because we're at the moment, Jeremy is working really hard to investigate that space. We've got lots of new docs, as we've been pointing out. I'm actually going to show two this week. So we've got Doc of the Week 1, which is applying migrations. I'm going to let Shay talk to this since he wrote this. Let me find it. Applying migrations. Shay?
Yeah, so I did a little bit of work a few months back to kind of redo and beef up the migration documents. This is a page that's specific to how you actually apply your migrations to the database. So there's two phases when you do migrations, right? First, you generate them, you make a change in your code model, then you generate a migration, and that creates, you know, the migration in the source. But then you have to actually apply it. The whole point of migrations is to do something with your database. And this is a subject where we see a lot of people sometimes getting confused around it. So I think this page is actually one of our important ones in the docs. So you should really, really understand the different options that you have here. And the main point is the way we recommend working with production databases. Okay, so there's what you're going to do when you're developing on your machine, and then there's what you're going to do on your production kind of database. The way we recommend doing stuff with production databases is to have EF Core generate SQL scripts for you. So you create the migration with EF Core, and then from that migration, you will generate a SQL script. You get out a SQL file that you can now apply, give your DBA, or simply apply directly to your database. There's a variant there called idempotent SQL scripts, which is, you know, we just scrolled by, which are scripts. They're similar to SQL scripts, but SQL scripts know how to migrate your database from one point to another, from this migration to that migration. You have to know exactly what you want to, where you want to migrate from and where you want to migrate to, and you have to generate that script and apply it. Idempotent scripts are done in a way that they basically kind of migrate your database all the way to the latest point, and you don't really have to worry about where your database already is, which is a really, really nice thing. So you can just generate that script, run it, and you can be fairly certain that it's going to always be there. Now, the important part, the reason we'd like to recommend SQL scripts for production use is, and this is a very important point, you can inspect those scripts before they actually get applied to the database. So what we see a lot of times is people, you know, the easiest thing that you do is you kind of apply your migrations when your application starts. That's the last option that you see there. That's the thing we usually recommend against, because if your application, when it starts applying your migration, you have no idea what it's doing. And migrations, unfortunately, are not something that will just, you know, EF Core cannot always perfectly do the 100% correct thing that you want it to do. The good example for this, and this page talks a lot about this, say you want to rename some property in your model, right? So you're going to change a name. But what EF Core actually sees is that in your old model, before they changed it, there was a property with this name, and now there's a property with that name. And in many cases, it's going to assume you dropped a column and you added a new column. It has no way of knowing you renamed the column. That's like a big general problem, not just in EF, but in general in change detection. And so the migration you're going to get generated out of that is sometimes going to be drop, you know, the old column, create a new column. If you just apply that blindly to your database and your intention was to rename, then you've just lost a whole lot of data. So our general statement here is do not apply migrations blindly to a production database, because who knows what's going to happen. You absolutely have to inspect things. And that's why we talk about SQL scripts. So I don't want to talk too much about this. This is why the doc page is here. But this is the page which talks about all these things and about the different, you know, advantages and disadvantages of each strategy. There's basically 4 strategies outlined here. One more thing, by the way, that I do have to say, again, when you're applying migrations at runtime, so your application starts up and it's, you know, it applies the migrations, then you have this tricky problem. What happens if other instances or other applications are accessing the database at that time, right? Let's say you deploy your application, But in many cases, you have, let's say, 5 application servers running the same application. So they're all going to try to apply your migrations at that point. And they're going to do, they're going to create a lot of mess. Because basically what we're kind of trying to say here is that applying the migration is not part of your application. It's part of a deployment phase. Just like when you change your application, you deploy a new version of that application, you deploy the new code. The same way, you have to deploy the new schema of your database via this mechanism, which is SQL scripts. So that's something we recommend really. We've seen a lot of users kind of get hit with this kind of stuff. So we have a lot of experience. And there's a lot of work also coming in EF Core 6, which we call migration bubbles, which will be, I think, possibly an additional strategy here, or we'll see how it all fits in, which will make this even better.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that, Shay. We do, if you scaffold a migration that is going to drop a column, for example, we do pick a warning out there when you do it, when you generate that migration. So make sure you pay attention to that, because it might be something like drop column that you don't want to happen. Okay, so the second doc of the week that we have is Interceptors. So Interceptors is something that was very popular in EF6. They were in EF6 basically limited to intercepting database operations. We've kind of extended that concept. So for example, now there is a save changes interception in EF Core 5 as well. This is the doc page on interceptors. So it goes through all the usual stuff like how you add interceptors, what it means to have multiple interceptors. And then it goes into the different ones that we have. So we have all these database interceptors for command, connection, transaction. And talks about the base classes for those. And then we have a bunch of examples here, which I think people will find quite useful. So one of the uses for command interception is to modify the SQL. So command interception, basically, right before it sends the SQL to the database, you can change it. So what we're doing here is saying, okay, what if we want to change one of the query hints? So in this case, I want to do option robust plan on here. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm looking for my query, and if I put this comment in here with this query hint on it, this gets generated. We can generate automatically as a tag on the query. Then I'm going to say, oh, for that query, do this, add this option to it. So that lets you basically modify the SQL in ways that in the ways that EF Core currently doesn't have first-class support for it. There's a bunch of caveats here. Interceptors are low level. If you do it wrong, it won't be forgiving. Like if you put something in here that EF doesn't understand, changes the result, the shape of the results, everything will just blow up because EF is still expecting, for example, the same results back. Another set of examples here is using connection interception for getting authentication. So basically, connection interception is useful because it allows you to asynchronously ask for things like access tokens. So we have some examples of doing that where you can ask for an access token. Be aware that this might not be the best way of doing it, and you should look at other places. And also be aware that if you make an expensive async call every time you open a database connection, then that's going to be a perf killer. So, Shai's done a lot of research on this, and this is an area where we're continually expanding and working on making better patterns. But if you are doing AAD, then this is kind of a good place to look at some ideas. And then this last one is quite advanced because I'm actually changing in this one whether or not we even send a command to the database. And by that, we can do a simple second level cache, essentially, where in this case, before execution, I'm going to look to see, do I have my command in the database? And if I do, I'm going to actually call this suppress with result. And that tells EF, don't send a command to the database. Instead, return this data reader for me. And so this data reader is like a cache data reader, which has what the database would have returned. So again, there's caveats on this. You'll have to figure out, how to deal with the gnarly issues around caching. And for example, when do you invalidate the cache? How does that happen? All of those kinds of issues still exist. But this shows basically how you can essentially get EF to think it's operating on the database, but actually you've done something else entirely. And then the last on here, like I said, we have save changes interception. So you can override save changes. There's also a save changes event, but save changes interception allows you to specifically in this case do async stuff. And so we can then in our interceptor here, we're doing a kind of auditing where I'm creating an instance of a new context, and then I'm calling save changes async on that. And so by this interception, you wouldn't be able to do that with event, because an event is not in an async context, for example. But by using an interceptor, I can do async operations while EF is doing save changes. Okay, so I think that's all we have for State of the Unicorn. There's a question here that I'm going to pop up that maybe Shay can answer.
What is the alternative to update the DB schema based on the model in a production stage besides using migration? So, I mean, migrations is technically an optional thing. Nobody forces you to do it. Some people, you can also update your database schema yourself, like completely externally, and not use EF core for this. Aside from this, if you want to keep your database schema in sync with your model, then migrations is the tool to do that. I'm not aware of anything else that at least that that's out there.
Right.
But a lot of people, use their database also as their source of truth. And then you can either create the code model from that. That's what we call scaffolding or reverse engineering. And that's a very popular kind of thing. So you make all your schema changes inside the database, and the code model, the EF core code model kind of follows that. There's various techniques for that. Or you just evolve each of them independently, and then it's your responsibility to keep them in sync.
It'd be worth also calling out that last time on the stand-up, Eric EJ showed a bunch of stuff around SQL projects, and so and backpacks, and so that is also a way that can work quite well. If you're
That's a good point.
SQL Server, at least, which supports backpacks. Okay, so moving on. Now Jeremy is our PM, and so he does PME type things. He had created this link, the show, the URL list for the show with 2 links in it. I couldn't figure out how to edit it. So we'll have Jeremy add the additional links later, but we do have some additional links to share with you anyway. Before we go into that, as always, the community stand-ups playlist with this and all the other ones is on the links here. And this is a link to the GitHub project that Giorgi worked on, and we'll look at later. So, in additional links, I think you wanted to talk through this one, Shay. This is from our good friend John P. Smith, author of EntityFramework for in Action. Updating data and catching SQL errors, interestingly.
So actually, this is extremely relevant to what Giorgi is about to talk about to today's session. John P. Smith is somebody that we work a lot with. So it's one of the prominent members of the community. He knows a lot about EF core. He wrote and is updating his book right now. And I think maybe those of you who have followed the community stand-up have already seen him here. This specific blog post, it's spookily complementary to what we're about to hear from Giorgi. This one is about what you do with exceptions once they come out of EntityFramework. How do you show them to your users? So basically, the problem is, when there's some sort of issue, let's say like a unique constraint violation, right? You try to insert something and you can't because there's a unique constraint violation. You get this cryptic, message. It's cryptic in the sense that users can't understand what it means. It's meant for programmers. So in general, exception messages from the database, but not only, are not meant to be shown directly to users. That is the general kind of, thing. And what John P. Smith shows here is an approach to of basically how to transform your exceptions into something systematically into something that you can use to surface the error to the user. So it's a little bit of like a generic framework kind of thing. He shows a wrapper around save changes that's going to intercept that exception, going to detect what it is and reformat it. Again, very close to what we're about to hear. So in the code that you actually see here, you can see that he's detecting a violation of a unique index on SQL Server, which is exactly the situation that I just said, and kind of munches around or formats around the text so that it can actually be shown to a user. If, Arthur, you scroll down just a little bit more, Up. Yeah, exactly. So you see the red thing. The above message that you see here is what EF Core emits, which is something that you typically don't want to show your users. So IDs, for example, exceptions contain personal data and secret data as well. So IDs are not something you want to expose in a web interface or an application. It's actually dangerous from a security standpoint. So never show exceptions to users unless you go in a very controlled manner through something like this, which is going to take that sensitive exception and transform it into what you see below, which is if you've decided that this number is the key value is something that you are willing to show to your users security wise, then this transforms it into an exception message that you can show. And yeah, John P. Smith shows like a very nice kind of way to do this. So I recommend to people to take a look at it if you have these issues of what to do with exceptions and how you inform your users. The thing to avoid is when that typical application, if something goes wrong and there's an exception, you get back this as a user, you just get an error has occurred, try again later. And nobody likes that, right? You don't know, there's no feedback there. So this is the problem that John P. Smith is kind of trying to solve. And with that, I think that's the perfect moment to go and ask Giorgi about what he does and what it's all about.
Yeah, it's all about exceptions.
It's all about exceptions.
So let me know when you want to share, and I will share for you, Giorgi.
Okay. Yeah. So as an introduction, so basically, when you are working with Entity Framework and when there is some issue with the insert or update or some other command, all you get is a DbUpdateException for every different type of error that occurs. So it's not straightforward to understand why the exception happened and whether it was a violation of a unique constraint or if you try to save some very long data in a column that does not allow something longer than the length of the column, or maybe you did not put a required value in one of the columns that's not nullable. So in order to find that out, even for a developer, you have to dig inside the inner exception of the DbUpdateException and check for the error number, which you have to find somewhere, usually by Googling or checking the docs for the database. So that's why I decided to write a small library that does all the hard work for you and gives you a separate exception for every scenario that you'll probably encounter. So I think it's better to show the demo.
Mm-hmm. So I'm guessing this is particularly interesting. I mean, it's interesting in general, but if you're using more than one database, it's even more interesting because then the problem is each database has its own way of saying, oh, a unique constraint violation, and you have to do that work for each separate database.
Yes, that's true. For every different database, you get different ways to find out what type of error has happened. So this library tries to solve that problem as well. So here is a basic command line application. It's based on the example from the Entity Framework tutorial. It's the usual block and
Arthur, maybe we can go full screen to see a bit better.
Sure.
Awesome. Go ahead, Giorgi.
So it's a usual command line application with just two entities. And for the blog entity, I have configured it to have the URL property required and to have a maximum length of 100. And as well, it's to have an unique index. So just an ordinary entity framework model.
stuff we can now violate, right?
Yes. So let's say that you try to save a new block. And as we don't set any of the properties on the block object, when you run the application, it will you will get a DbException that we will see in a moment. I think I have to run the migrations first. Yeah, I will generate the migrations.
Demos always have a little bit of setup.
Yeah. So it's interesting because we were talking on the team recently about whether or not when we're showing simple stuff, we show using ensure created, which of course is bad practice for anything other than prototyping and testing, or whether we actually always add migrations like this. You know, I think adding migrations is not as scary and difficult as some people think. It's quite simple, as hopefully this will show, because eating my words if this doesn't go well. But of course, you do have to remember to do it as well.
Yes.
Because back in the old days of the EF6, when we had database initializers, this would have just worked. Silently created the database for you, which was awesome.
Was that better?
No, that's why we stopped doing it. It had lots of problems.
Yeah, a lot of things that seem like they do a lot of transparent work for you end up actually like screwing up more than they help.
Yeah, and it's ironic because typically finding a static place at the start of your application, as in main or some other place to do something, is not too difficult. But doing all of the locking in EntityFramework so that wherever you happen to first use it from, it makes sure that that is a single place where it can safely do this operation that has to block everything else.
Of course.
That had a big bug tail on it. So it's kind of interesting how an architecture where you say, we're going to do it for you, introduces an issue like when and where, that really isn't an issue if you don't try and do it automatically, because people can easily find when and where.
Exactly. It's not a thing you should try to automate, basically. Yeah.
So what we could do here, Giorgi, rather than doing the migrations, if you go to the top of your blogging context there.
I think it's working though, no?
Oh, it is working? Okay.
Yeah,
Good.
I think it worked.
Okay.
Yeah, so as I try to save a blog which doesn't have this URL property which is required, I did not set it, so that's a exception that I got. Kind of the usual SQL exception with inside this inner exception. So the only thing that tells us that it's a required field missing is this little 515 here, and I guess no one knows that by heart.
Yeah.
So it's very.
Or what's worse, what I've seen is people who actually look at the message, at the text, and kind of look at this, which is absolutely a horrible thing, which you should never do.
Yes,
Yeah,
especially
terrible.
Especially because that text on a country with a developer's box with a different different globalization. So like Shai's in Berlin, right? If he had German settings, then that would come out as a German string. So anything that's to check the English text is fundamentally not going to work globally.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you want to find out why this DbException happened, you have to do something like exception, inner exception, cast it to SQL exception, and check the number property and write some magic numbers there. And so basically, if this is true, then you know that it's a required field that is missing. So to avoid doing that at every place where you have this catch clause, so one of the workarounds that you can probably do is override the save changes method, which I have not done now. But that's also possible. So you can override the save changes method here, catch the exception, and throw some more meaningful error, and that will work in every place where you call either save changes or save changes async if you override that one as well. So to avoid doing that and having to copy paste that from one project to another and from one database to another database, you can install this library from NuGet. So as you can see, there are different versions of this library for different databases. The first one is the one that is shared by all these versions. So when you install the SQL Server version, it will automatically download this common one as well. So don't install the common one directly. So I'll go ahead and install the SQL Server version now.
Postgres downloaded almost as much as SQL Server. I like that.
Yes, I like that too. And I like that Postgres is more downloaded than MySQL version.
Yeah, there was actually a question here. Same for Postgres? Yep, same for Postgres. It's all there.
That's part of the beauty of this library, right? Is that you don't have to care. It's going to expose the same thing regardless of which database you are using.
Yeah.
And once you download the library, you just call the use exception processor because naming is hard. So, and now you can go back to the code and what's the name of that exception?
Okay. Cannot insert now.
And so this time when I run the app, it will hit this catch block. So you don't have to check all the details of the exception yourself.
It's coming.
Yeah.
Streaming always makes stuff go slower at the same time. It's
so
not just Teams.
Yeah, so this catch block caught the exception that the one of the fields is now, and that's how you avoid doing all the ugly stuff with exceptions and exception numbers. And this exception also has the same inner exception if for some reason you want to. So the inner exception here is again the same SQL exceptions that we saw in the previous example. So this is still here if you want for some reason to do something with the message or log the inner exception or process it somehow.
You could very easily use this with the stuff that Shay was showing from John P. Smith earlier to then further kind of create user-facing messages and such like. So,
like John P. Smith's article does exactly what you showed before. So he has to identify, the exception by looking at the 515 and all that kind of stuff, right? He has to do the heavy lifting there. So this is actually the perfect complement because he could use this library to figure out which kind of exception it is and then to format it appropriately.
Yeah. Actually, I found that library about two days ago, that blog post, and we exchanged some ideas in the comments of that article.
Awesome. And by the way, to everybody listening, we will add the link to that blog post to the URL list, as Arthur said, so don't worry about it. We'll just add the link.
So I would certainly be interested in seeing a little bit about how you actually implemented the use method that you put on there, use exception processor, and how that integrates with the EF core pipeline. That will be interesting for me.
Okay, I'll be showing that in 2 minutes. Before I do that, I want to say that this exception is cannot insert null exception. It inherits from the DbUpdateException. So this means that when you plug this, your code will not magically start throwing unhandled exceptions out of nowhere.
That's very cool.
Yes, that's the right way to do it.
It's interesting, because so we have a style that or a guideline on EF Core where we don't seal things by default. We in fact make everything unsealed and virtual by default and only seal things where necessary, which goes against a lot of the guidelines. But one of the reasons for that is for things like this, where if we had sealed that exception type, which is something that people do, and it's something that if we had thought, well, nobody needs to do their own DbUpdateException, we should seal it, then we would have prevented this. So kind of by leaving it open, yes, you can shoot yourself in the foot more easily, but it also makes it possible to extend in ways that we hadn't previously considered that somebody would do. So
otherwise, if this did not have the DbUpdateException as a base class, you would get this catch block would not
exactly
if you did not edit, so you would get lots of exceptions out of nowhere.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. Yeah.
That I'll just go one step further, Arthur, and say people are probably not aware, but we go even one step further, as I said, and there's actually no internal code in EF Core as well, or very little. So the stuff that we consider internal, we actually make public, but we put it in an internal namespace because we say the exact same thing that Arthur said. We don't know where maybe our users are going to need to, deal with something that is not exposed publicly. So we want to allow them to do that in case they have some sort of need, right? Or maybe some idea that we haven't had. So the product is always like extremely open in that way. Of course, we don't commit to not breaking you if you use those internal APIs. So it's not something we recommend, but it is something that you can use to unblock yourself if you need to.
Yeah, and that comes from, previous to working on EF Core, being very aware of the places. I'm not saying there were lots of them, but there are places where the well-known way to do something was by reflection accessing some internal API because it just didn't work and that was the only workaround. And so, by removing some of the friction from that, hopefully not too much so that people start using it everywhere and then we break everything all the time, but by removing some of the friction, we make it easier for you to do things like that with the code.
In case anybody gets stressed by what we're talking about, there's also an analyzer that you get with EF Core that if you do use one of these APIs, an internal API, then it's going to flag it. It's going to give you like a compile time warning, which you can also configure as an error. So you're at least made aware of the fact that you're depending on an API that isn't stable.
Yeah. Okay, so what have we got here, Giorgi?
So now I added two entries which have the URL pointing to the same value. So as the property was marked as unique in the database, it will now hit this catch block here.
I have to say, I love stories like this where, sorry, I'm going to first let you finish.
Yeah, so as expected, so we now get the unique constraint violation error, and you can probably show some user-friendly message now to the user. One thing that I found is that there is a small bug in the library which might break some of the use cases. It's the entries property that in these exceptions it's always empty. So with the DbException you get the so if you got the DbUpdateException, it would point you to the entities that caused the error, but I have some bugs there which cause this to be empty, and yeah, I found this today when preparing for demo.
That's the way it always is. You find a bug when you try and demo it. No, that's cool.
It is, yeah. So yeah, well, what I just wanted to say is why I love seeing things like this is that it's something that is first of all, it's an extension that comes out and integrates very beautifully, right? I mean, all you had to do was add that using exception processor thing. So it shows that the extensibility here of EF Core is sufficient to allow for things like this. And I love how something that is not there in the product itself and EF Core itself can happen by a community thing, and it doesn't have to come from Microsoft. I love this kind of story where we have an infrastructure, and then the community builds upon it and adds other things that are missing in the original thing, and that's great.
Yeah. So this use exception processor method is the same in all these libraries. So if you switch to a different database, all you have to do is replace this namespace here.
But then, Giorgi, I have a question. So what happens if my application uses two databases? Don't I get like an ambiguity between which method I'm going to call?
Yes, if you need to probably, I will install the Postgres one now, and you will need so if you want to, if you have, but in that case you have two different DB contexts. Yes, so if I comment this now, it will ask me which one to use, and the namespace is different, but this is an extension method, so you can just use this fully.
You're saying that because you have two DB contexts in two different files, then each file is going to have the correct using statement.
Yeah, correct using statement, and these exceptions are coming from this common library, and so they have the same namespace. So you can use them.
I'll just say there is also the pattern. There is also the possibility of having a DB context where the options get injected, and the options are the thing from the outside that are going to say this is Postgres or this is not Postgres. And in that case, there are at least some scenarios where the context is going to be just one context rather than two, and then so it's the place that's going to create the options to be injected that's going to have to choose the correct using the correct one. Anyway, it's the same kind of problem.
You can call it with fully qualified
Yes.
namespace and class name.
Indeed.
Can we look at the use exception processor method?
Arthur wants to peek under the hood.
Yeah, I do. I do.
So first of all, this is all these exceptions that I had. Just constructors, nothing else. And this is the common source of where all the magic happens, and these are the database specific projects. So this use exception processor method comes from the package of database specific library, and I think I should start from top to bottom. So in EF core there is this internal public, but one of the classes from the internal namespace that manages states, as I guess.
As Shay was saying, you can see that EF 1001 error. If you hover over it again, there at the bottom there, saying it's an internal API. So this is exactly what we were just talking about. Ironically, I didn't know you were doing this.
That's very funny. Yes, that's very funny.
And the state manager is an internal service implemented by the iState Manager interface. So we let you replace that service if you want to with your own implementation. Now we could add another method to our state manager with save changes with another option, or we could, change one of these and it would break that code. But usually it's fairly easy for then, in cases like this, to update it and release another version anyway. So in reality, this is exactly, the idea of being able to do override internal code. So pretty cool. However, I would say that now with the F-Core 5, given that we have save changes interception that we talked about, you could do it with an interceptor, hopefully, and that should, if I'm right, not require you use any internal code. So that might be a thing to look at.
Exactly.
Yeah, I also thought about doing that.
Yeah.
That would make it safe going forward because we wouldn't break that API as opposed to, this one we probably wouldn't break either so much, but it could happen.
Yeah. The only disadvantage that I thought about the interceptor is that when I catch this DbUpdateException, I have access to the entries property, which now is a bug that I mentioned earlier, but I could use these entries to populate the entries of the subclass. And with DbInterceptor, I'm not sure if there is anything that's pointing to the entry that caused the command to fail.
If that isn't there in the event data for that interceptor, then file an issue, because I think it would be useful to put it there if we don't have it. So we can certainly make that available in the interceptor. We have a question here. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I have not checked. Maybe it's there, but it's definitely here.
So we have a question here from Wraith2 as one of the big SQL contributors. Boilerplate code, should this be generated? We always hear this. Somebody on every EF community stand-up, somebody's going to say, use source generators for that. So here's our use source generators question. I don't know the answer.
I have to say, I just did like a source generator project in my own driver, and there's this like fine line where you're spending a lot of time getting the source generator just right, and it would have been easier to just write the thing that you're generating, as long as it doesn't change like all the time. So that's actually the question, right? So have to be very disciplined about your decision making when you look at code generation.
So one of the things that I'm sorry, if you want to show more, go ahead, Giorgi. Otherwise, I've got other questions.
So do I. Yeah.
So one of the things that nobody has asked, and it seems like a elephant in the room question to me, is why is EF Core itself not validating these things before it sends them to the database? Because in EF6 that would have been the case. EF6, for example, would have checked that null and would have thrown an exception saying that's a null and you're trying to save it to the database when it's non-nullable before trying to send it to the database. So I mean, and the answer to that is nuanced, but fundamentally boils down to there are so many places that you can potentially implement validation of your data that having it an additional one be in EF Core is not usually very useful. So in other words, having that code floating around in EF Core and EF Core doing it is not very useful because you need to do validation before you even get to basically letting the application try and save that. There's nuances to that as well, such as the unique constraint one is very interesting because in general EF is looking at only a small it's a subset of the data, right? So you could say I only want one of your URL to be unique, and if we tried to insert two of them at the same time, we could detect that. But if you inserted one and one save changes and then created a new context and tried to insert another, EF would have no way of knowing that that violates it. And so that's a place where the database has that additional information. Now, at your application level, you could probably do that validation in different ways as well, but it doesn't naturally fit into the EF Core model. So that's why we kind of stay out of the validation business, and you put constraints in the database to make sure your actual data that is saved never gets, violated, and then you put additional validation at the application level, possibly, both in the user interface and then also in your controllers or whatever you're using to write your code, to access to do your business logic, as it were. And EF just kind of stays out of the picture. So I thought it was worth talking about that because it's a question we sometimes get from people, especially people coming from EF6, is why is it happening this way? We've got a lot of comments from people saying this looks useful, well done, and stuff. So
very
it's
cool.
always nice to see. Good job.
Yeah, there is one exception that stopped working with EntityFramework.5,
Okay.
which is this numeric overflow, arithmetic overflow. It's when you have the decimal column with scaling precision, and you try to insert something that does not fit there.
Yes, we made a breaking change in that.
Yeah, that was a breaking change.
Very intentional.
Always encrypted, I think. So you still get the DbUpdateException, but the inner exception in EF5 is argument exception, and that does not happen anymore, this case statement.
And that's because there's a long history of how SQL client handles parameters and the facets that you set on them. And historically, if you set a precision and scale on a SQL parameter, then SQL client would truncate it to that precision and scale and send it to the database truncated. Now, in the original versions of EF and up to EF6, we didn't set precision and scale on those things at all, and there were all the valid reasons for not doing that, but that meant that we sent these things to the database, where the database then would round and not truncate. So if we started setting precision and scale, we would end up being a situation where it was previously rounding, it would now be truncating, and we didn't want to do that back in the day. SQL Client has since updated their behavior to match SQL Server. They did that in the 2.0 or 2.1 release of Microsoft Data SQL Client, such that it now matches the SQL Server behavior and rounds before sending to the database. So that allows us to set precision and scale and allow SQL client to round before sending to the database without breaking the existing behavior. Now, if you have your precision and scale set incorrectly, it could result in a breaking change, because if your model says precision is 18.2, precision scale is 18.2, and it's actually 18.4 in your database or something like that, SQL client is going to say it's 18.2 and it's going to round it to that. So that's why it's a breaking change. But overall, the behavior is much more consistent and much better. And we had to do that because now with things like always encrypted, having the correct facets is very important. Like always encrypted will just reject it if your decimal is a different actual SQL type than what the parameter says it was. So long story short, that's why you're no longer getting numeric overflow from the database. You're getting it from SQL client, and it's the exception has changed. But it was all worth doing.
Yes. Is it okay if I hijack for like a small thing?
Yeah.
Because it's very related. Maybe you can go to my screen, Arthur.
Yes,
if possible, because it's extremely related. When I saw this this issue,
I almost went there and then I messed it up. There we go.
Cool. So what you see here is an issue I worked on for .NET 5. So this is already in .NET 5, and so this is an alternative kind of approach to the problem that Giorgi is trying to solve. It's not at all like an actual solution, but it shows people how this world of databases is. So there's a standard that manages the SQL. There's a SQL standard, right? It's notoriously not respected by different databases. It's actually a little bit useless, because if you kind of look at the standard, like very few databases actually respect it. But still, it is kind of useful in various situations. Now, the SQL standard does define a unified, we can call it like a unified set of exceptions or error codes. So when a database sends back an error, there's like a hard-coded standard unified kind of coded error strings which have clear meanings. So there's a way in the SQL standard that a database is supposed to say this is a unique constraint violation, or this is a missing whatever. There's like a whole list of those values. Now, one of the things is that unfortunately SQL Server is one of the databases that unfortunately notoriously doesn't follow the SQL standard very faithfully. And since .NET has historically come from the SQL Server world, in back in the day, like in the old Microsoft days, everything kind of was centered around Microsoft technologies. The database API system data ADO.NET is kind of reflects it. So if you looked at Java, then the DbException, the exception of the language, contains this thing called SQL state. That's the name of the standard. So you can get the SQL state from the JDBC, from the Java Database API, but in .NET you can't, because it wouldn't be useful for SQL Server. So one thing that we pushed for in .NET 5 was to get the standard property onto DbException. Now, if you look, I kind of even documented it. If you actually look, I looked across databases. So Postgres implements this, MySQL implements this, but SQL Server doesn't. And although there's like partial support, and SQLite also doesn't. So some databases support it, and some databases don't. And the idea here would be, we've had conversations with the SQL client people, for the driver to actually expose this code, this standardized code, and internally translate the SQL Server errors and whatever they are, and expose them as the standard codes. And if with time, drivers start to actually implement this kind of thing as it is. This is my optimistic self, obviously, which dreams of better days in the future. But if drivers kind of start aligning up to this kind of standard, then in the end, you've basically solved the problem at a much lower level, rather than having an EF core specific package, which I think is absolutely great, and it solves the problem today, rather than some dream of solving it tomorrow, which will never happen, in fact, in my opinion. But anyway. I still allow myself to dream. Happen. Yeah, maybe it will. But the idea would be that this is actually the responsibility of a driver to expose the standard SQL code for for a unique constraint violation. And if that ever does actually happen, then at that point, this effort at a much higher level that is necessary today would kind of no longer be necessary anymore. And this is the way that a database API should look like in the ideal world. Unfortunately, we're in the real world, and things look very different, and it's very hard to converge the different databases. Databases is a very difficult, world. And another thing I just have to show that also went in, which is like extremely, again, related, is this thing here, which is a property, again, on DbException, which says to whoever cares if this exception is expected to be transient or not. Transient exceptions is about errors that are not, that are temporary. For example, maybe there was some sort of deadlock, and if you retry that operation, then it will not deadlock and everything will be fine. Maybe there was some sort of issue. There could be many issues. That could be it. A network error, for example, is not. It could be also a transient error, because if you try it again, then maybe the network is now okay. So there's this distinction between whether you want to retry or not. And that's important. I'm again hijacking this to talk about something that EF Core does do. EF Core has something called a retrying execution strategy. So in the box, EF Core comes with a thing that basically sees, oh, there was some sort of transient error, like a network error. I'm going to just retry this again in case it solves the problem. And this is something you get for free in EF Core. It kind of solves the problem.
You have to enable it. It's not enabled by default, but yes.
It's opt-in, but for free. So you don't have to. You don't need like an extra thing or a lot of ceremony. And if your network is flaky or you have like deadlocks sometimes in certain situations, then it can just gloss over the problem for you. Not saying you should probably fix those network problems and those deadlocks, but still, this is some sort of solution.
This is if you're using SQL Azure, it's recommended that you use connection resiliency, because the way SQL Azure works, and I don't know all of the most recent details of like when it does this and that, but it can basically bump your connection because it needs to free resources or move somewhere else. And in a lot of they actually recommend in those cases that this is a transient error and retry it and do it from the beginning. So yeah, if you're using running against SQL Azure, you should by default enable the execution strategy. But it's available across databases, and so it's also useful in other places too.
Yeah, I know that in SQL Server, deadlocks is a good reason, because if your code is written in a certain way that it could produce deadlocks, then it's going to run fine. But when two pieces of code happen to run exactly at the same time, then you're going to get a deadlock exception from SQL Server, and that's transient because it happened only because the other piece of code was running at the same time as you. Therefore, you can kind of get rid of this problem. This is not the right way to get rid of it, but it is a way to get rid of it by using a retrying kind of strategy. And this issue was again an attempt to push that problem down into the database driver, in the sense that the database driver exposes that information. This is a transient exception or not. So it's interesting to me how we're kind of dealing with the same problems of exceptions at very different levels of the stack here, and I think that's worth kind of thinking about.
Yes. So I think we're out of time. So I think we can probably end there. Thanks very much to everybody for joining us, and thank you again, Giorgi, for sharing that stuff. That's really interesting. And Shay, I will talk to you later, probably.
Yep. Thanks, Giorgi.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Thanks. And we'll see you next time.